Hello, my dear Cedees students. I welcome you to a micro lecture on functional matrix hypothesis. Before we kind of start the lecture, to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Agarsh. I am a consultant orthodontist based out in Bangalore. I'm also a faculty member at Cedees, and I welcome you to the micro lecture on functional matrix hypothesis, which, when you consider from the point of view of an examination, it is a very important question, often comes as a long essay question, frequently repeated as well. But keeping the point of view of examination aside, it also is a very crucial theory in understanding craniofacial growth or growth of the head and neck region. Let's just jump into what this theory is. Let's simplify the definition. Let's look at the different parts of the hypothesis itself. Before we go into the actual theory in itself, we need to understand that there is something called as the genetic paradigm and the functional paradigm in craniofacial orthodontics or craniofacial growth. Now, what are these paradigms? A paradigm is just basically a set of beliefs. So you have one set of beliefs that says that craniofacial growth, the premise of it or the essence of it is what controls craniofacial growth. Is it the genes, or is it coming from internally within the system, or is it outside or under epigenetic control? What does epigenetic mean? Epigenetic simply means outside the system of the genetic makeup or within the body. Like environmental influences are the external factors, where one of the most closely associated terms with functional matrix hypothesis is that form follows function, which basically means that the entire skeletal craniofacial skeleton or the craniofacial growth, the form of craniofacial growth follows functional demands or is dictated by function. And function simply comes from epigenetic factors, which is basically environmental factors or external factors. So the genetic paradigm basically states that control of craniofacial growth comes from the genetic or the internally controlled genetic processes or from external factors or epigenetic factors. So this is the premise of the genetic paradigm versus functional paradigm. And if you look at all the theories, if you open your book and look at all the theories of growth, you have the genetic theory by Brody, you have the sutural theory by Seicher and Weinman, you have the cartilaginous theory by James Scott, you have the functional matrix hypothesis, you have the servo system theory. The basic premise of all of these theories is of all these theories laid down by scientists is what is controlling craniofacial growth. Is it genes? Is it sutures? Is it cartilage? Is it function? So why do we have to understand this? We need to understand that functional matrix hypothesis is a functional paradigm subscribing theory. It subscribes to the functional paradigm. Now, the functional matrix hypothesis itself was introduced in Vistas in Orthodontics. That's where it was first published in 1962 by Melvin Moss, uh, which is a picture of him in the slide, which is Melvin Moss. And now, when you look at functional matrix hypothesis, it has a huge definition and quite an overwhelming one in terms of how to remember it while you have to write an answer or how to kind of put it out when it's asked as a Viva question. So let's first look at the definition and then let's look at how we break it down, simplify, and understand the definition. Now, looking at the definition itself, functional matrix hypothesis claims that the origin, growth, and maintenance of all skeletal tissues and organs are always secondary, compensatory, and obligatory responses to temporally and operationally prior events or processes that occur in specifically related non-skeletal tissues, organs, or functioning spaces. This is the definition of functional matrix hypothesis that was given by Melvin Moss. It is a huge one, which you have to kind of replicate. Now, to replicate anything, let's just try to understand the meaning, try to make it a little easier for ourselves. And then, probably it would be a little easier. I hope it would be easier to kind of put this down in an order. Now, what did it state? Basically, what it stated is form follows function. We still stick to that premise of form follows function. That is, craniofacial growth or the growth of the craniofacial structure, the form of it is dictated by function. let's look at the definition itself and break it into three parts. The first part is that skeletal tissues are basically affected or influenced by some processes, which is shown in the middle of the diagram with the arrow marks. And these processes occurring in non-skeletal tissues, organs, and functioning spaces. So basically, you have skeletal tissues, you have non-skeletal tissues. The processes that are occurring in the non-skeletal tissues, organs, or functioning spaces basically affects the origin, growth, and maintenance of the skeletal tissue. And all these processes that occur, the processes that kind of occur in the non-skeletal tissues, organs, and functioning spaces are happening temporally and operationally prior. They are events that happen before, and as a response to these processes, the origin, growth, and maintenance of skeletal tissues occur. And how does this response occur? This response is secondary, compensatory, and an obligatory response to these processes. So, how do we understand this? Coming back to recapping what this means, is that in the definition, you have two parts. You have the skeletal tissue and the non skeletal tissues, or organs and functioning spaces. The origin, growth, and maintenance of the skeletal tissue is influenced or is a response. It is a secondary, compensatory, and obligatory response to processes that are operationally and temporally prior events or processes occurring in non-skeletal tissues, organs, and functioning spaces. Now, if you look at the form follows function, here the origin, growth, and maintenance of the skeletal tissue is the form, and this form is dictated by the processes that are occurring in the non-skeletal tissues, organs, and functioning spaces, which is the function. So eventually, form follows function also holds true or is the basic essence of the definition itself. And there are three parts to it: the skeletal tissue, the processes that occur prior in the non skeletal tissues, organs, and functioning spaces. This is basically to break down the definition or kind of deconstruct and understand it in a simplified way. Now, let's look at the theory itself. The theory was based out on the functional cranial theory that was given by van der Klaas, which was a concept that was given. Now, if you look at the living head, the craniofacial region, it carries out a number of functions, right? It carries out respiration, it carries out vision, there is mastication, there is olfaction, there is speech, there is deglutition. A whole bunch or a whole host of functions are being carried out by the craniofacial region or the living head. Now, all of these functions are carried out by something known as the functional cranial component. It is known as the functional cranial component, which basically comprises of your skeletal tissues, soft tissues, and all the structures that are present within the system. So this entire system is called the functional cranial component, which eventually helps in performing all of these functions of respiration, vision, mastication, etc. Now let's break down this functional cranial component or classify it as it's been classified in the theory. This functional cranial component is divided into two things. It is divided into a skeletal unit. It is divided into something called as the functional matrix. Now, the skeletal unit is further divided or further comprises of the microskeletal unit and the macroskeletal unit. The functional matrix are of two types. There is a periosteal matrix and there is a capsular matrix. Simple. All of the functions are carried by the functional cranial component, further divided into skeletal unit and functional matrix, and further divided into microskeletal unit and macroskeletal unit, and two kinds of functional matrices, which is periosteal and the capsular matrix. Now, what we have to do is look at them one by one and understand how they all come together and explain or explain how craniofacial growth kind of occurs. What is a skeletal unit? Skeletal unit is basically the bony structure that provides or supports the functional matrix. It provides the necessary biomechanical role for providing protection, but it's not an individual bone, but the function that it kind of supports. It's an entire unit. The skeletal unit is basically an entire structure or acts in unity to support a particular function, and it supports the functional matrix as well. Now, if you look, we saw that the skeletal units have two parts. There are microskeletal and macroskeletal units. How do we understand what is a macroskeletal unit and a microskeletal unit? Now, if you consider the mandible or the maxilla, the entire maxilla, the entire mandible is a macroskeletal unit, because this macroskeletal unit is made up of a number of adjoining microskeletal units that kind of come together to perform the function as a unit as a whole. If you look at the maxilla, the entire maxilla is made up of a number of parts. It's made up of the nasal part, the orbital part, there's a pneumatic part, there's a palatal part, there is a basal part. All of these individual parts are known as the microskeletal unit. And when they kind of come together to perform a function as a unit, they become the macroskeletal unit. In this case, it is the maxilla. Now, if you consider the lower jaw, the mandible, it has a number of microskeletal units. Something very similar to the maxilla, but it has the coronoid microskeletal unit, the condylar process, the angular process, the basal process, the alveolar process. Now, all of these are the microskeletal units. When they adjoining microskeletal units comprise together and perform function as a unit, it becomes the macroskeletal unit. So this micro and the macroskeletal unit basically is providing support and protection to the functional matrix it is associated with. Now let's look at what is a functional matrix. We saw that there are functional matrices of two types. There is periosteal matrix and there is capsular matrix. Remember, my dear students, that all the glands, muscles, nerves, blood vessels, fat, teeth are all examples or all constituents of the functional matrix, even your spaces, organs, etc. So if someone asks you, what is teeth? Teeth is a functional matrix. Fat is a functional matrix. Muscle is a functional matrix. So each of these functional matrices could be associated with a particular micro or a macroskeletal unit. Now let's look at further what this means when you say there are two kinds of matrices. The periosteal matrix is basically all your muscles, nerves, vessels, glands, anything that is solid. It does not exist as a volume. It is a muscle, gland, nerve, or teeth. All of these are periosteal matrices, and mostly muscles. Muscles are very, very important examples of periosteal matrix, and they have a direct and an active influence of their skeletal unit. So you will have a periosteal matrix to which you will have a related skeletal unit. Now, this skeletal unit and the functional matrix or the periosteal matrix are in are something that's part of a system where the periosteal matrix will influence the growth of a particular skeletal unit. How does this happen? This is directly and actively influencing the skeletal unit. Now, muscle attachments, direct or indirect muscle attachments, are going to influence our periosteal matrices, which is going to influence the skeletal unit. How does it do that? It does that by altering either the shape or size of the skeletal unit. Say, for example, there is atrophy of the periosteal matrix. If you consider an example of the coronoid process and the temporalis muscle, in this example, temporalis muscle would be a periosteal matrix and the skeletal unit would be the coronoid process. Now, if there is atrophy or if there is a lack of functioning of the periosteal matrix, then it is observed that the bone does not grow. The form is dictated by the function. Always remember that the form is dictated by the function. So the bone structure of the coronoid process is directly and actively influenced by the functioning of the periosteal matrix, which in this case is the temporalis muscle. Now, if the temporalis muscle undergoes atrophy, you see that the bone is also very small, it's diminuted in size. If, on the other hand, there is a hypertrophy of the periosteal matrix or an excessive functioning or contraction of the temporalis muscle, you notice in these cases that the coronoid process is also larger, bigger in size. So this is how the periosteal matrix acts directly and actively on its related skeletal unit. And what kind of growth does it bring about? It brings about something known as transformative growth in its particular skeletal unit. What do you mean by transformative growth? Is that growth that occurs by bone deposition on one side and resorption on the other side. This is this is pertaining to the periosteal matrix. This is to further explain the example that I just stated. You have the temporalis muscle, which is the periosteal matrix, and you have the attached coronoid process. It is attached to the coronoid process. Now, if the skeletal matrix of the temporalis muscle here is stimulated, there is growth of the coronoid process. If it is highly functioning, there is a larger coronoid process. If it is resected or atrophy, there is a small diminutive coronoid process. So stimulation of the skeletal matrix is what is the function that will dictate the form of a particular skeletal unit. And that form is brought about by transformative growth, as we saw in the previous slide. And what do you mean by transformative growth? It is growth that occurs by deposition and resorption. There'll be deposition on one side and resorption on the other. Now, what is capsular matrix? I said anything that exists not as volumes or spaces are periosteal matrices. Capsular matrix basically exists as volumes or spaces. Now, the two main important prominent examples are the neurocranial capsule and the orofacial capsule in the head and neck region. Now, the neurocranial capsule and the orofacial capsule, if you look at the entire capsule, it exists as a volume, right? Now, within this volume or within this space, you have many periosteal matrices and the related microskeletal and macroskeletal units. So, the capsular matrix kind of encapsulates all of the periosteal matrices as well as the related micro or macroskeletal unit. So there are two kinds. There is neurocranial capsule and the orofacial capsule, which is basically an envelope that is sandwiched between two covering layers. Now, how does the capsular matrix act on its related skeletal unit? Basically, when there is growth occurring, when there is craniofacial growth, the first event that occurs is that there is a translative growth or a enlargement. Basically, the capsule enlarges, or the capsular matrix kind of undergoes translative growth, which is basically an alteration in the spatial position. It enlarges. It just basically enlarges in size. When it enlarges in size, what happens is that, like I said, all the periosteal matrices, the respective skeletal units, are present within this capsule. Now, all of this are passively and secondarily moved to a new position when the capsule enlarges. And that is known as the translative growth, where there is, compared to the transformative growth that occurs in a periosteal matrix, here there is an alteration in the spatial position. It is all moved passively into a new position. There is no bone deposition resorption here. Because of enlargement, because of an enlargement in the volume or the space, they're all moved passively and secondarily to a new position. So this is translative growth, which occurs in capsular matrix. And this occurs because the capsular matrix acts indirectly and passively on the related skeletal units. Whereas in periosteal matrix, it's a direct and active influence on the related skeletal units. Now, the neurocranial capsule is basically the brain, the leptomeninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. So, first, there would be an expansion of the enclosed protected capsular matrix volume. Because of that, all the periosteal matrices within that capsule is carried outward in a passive manner. That is what occurs. Then you have the orofacial capsular matrix. First, we saw that there is neurocranial capsule. Then we have the orofacial capsule, which is basically limited externally by the skin, internally by the mucous membrane. So basically, your oronasopharyngeal space, that volumetric space is your orofacial capsular matrix, which is very important to carry out all the functions later. This occurs in the third month of pregnancy, where there is a compensatory increase in the capsule. There is translative growth, as we understand. Now, we've often thought that there is, all the skull bones grow first, because of which the, all the bones within a capsule, which if you consider the maxilla, the mandible, the orbit, we often think that the maxilla increases in size, the mandible increases in size. First, there is bone growth, because of which there is expansion of the brain, the neural mass. This is a misnomer, my dear students. What actually happens is that there is primary expansion of the neural mass that occurs first. First, there is a translative growth, or there is an expansion of the neurocranial capsule or the neural mass, which brings about a secondary compensatory growth of the skull. In response to this translative growth, to accommodate for this expansion, there will be transformative growth, by the micro and the macroskeletal units by action of the periosteal matrix. Let's look at it and understand the entire theory in its essence. We saw that functions are carried out by the functional cranial component. You have the functional matrix and the skeletal unit. Functional matrices are of two types. You have a capsular matrix, you have a periosteal matrix. Each periosteal matrix is kind of associated with a microskeletal unit. It actively and directly influences the microskeletal unit to bring about transformative growth, which is bone growth by deposition and resorption. The capsular matrix, which kind of enlarges first, brings about a translative growth of the entire macroskeletal unit. Now, if you consider craniofacial growth as a whole, uh, where the entire craniofacial region or the head and neck region kind of grows, it is by virtue of both the transformative growth and the translative growth. And always remember, it is the capsular matrix that kind of expands first or has a translative growth, because of which there is an outward, repositioning or a spatial alteration of the macroskeletal unit. And in response to this translative growth, there is transformative growth in respective microskeletal units, which is brought about by the periosteal matrix. And the entire transformative growth and the translative growth together is the craniofacial growth or the growth of the head and neck region. And this, my dear students, is the essence of the functional matrix hypothesis, which has kind of been broken down in this micro lecture in a little detailed fashion, which also probably gives you enough material to kind of write the answer, present it well, but also to understand what the terms of functional matrix, skeletal unit, what is transformative growth, what is translative growth, what are all these terms signifying, or what does it mean? And in the end, I think the definition, that huge, overwhelming definition, would make a bit more sense, would make it a little bit more easier to kind of understand. And with this, we come to the end of this micro lecture. Thank you for listening.